Henry and Donald have a surprising amount in common. Both were second sons who lost older brothers. Both inherited and spent vast fortunes. Both were germophobes. And both married mistresses and regretted it. But the similarities run deeper. History remembers Henry VIII as a powerful king. Yet his character was shaped by insecure beginnings.
Henry was a second son of a newly arrived king. Henry VII had won his crown on the battlefield, the Battle of Bosworth. He had a very tenuous claim to the throne, and so Henry VIII was part of a slightly fragile dynasty.
Henry VIII is the spare to his older brother Arthur. He was 6 foot, which is very, very tall for someone in this period. He was very athletic, but he's never supposed to be king.
When his brother Arthur died, it fell to Henry to follow in the footsteps of their domineering father.
Henry VII was quite a formidable and feared ruler, and certainly his son feared him very much.
We tend to think of him as a sort of grumpy miser, all in black, maybe very emotionally cold and very Machiavellian.
And Henry will certainly learn from his father habits of tremendous ruthlessness.
Like Henry, Donald Trump was the second son of a new dynasty. His father, Fred Trump, had built a New York real estate business from scratch. And Donald, too, was thrust unexpectedly into the hot seat. His older brother dropped out of the family business and died young of alcoholism.
I think one of the interesting things about Donald Trump is that he was not the heir. So he wasn't the person who was expected to take over the real estate empire, the carrier of the bloodline. And maybe that puts an additional pressure on the second son. That gives them an extra bit of competitiveness.
Donald's duty was made clear to him from an early age.
Fred Trump was the quintessential self-made man. I mean, he's been described as the Henry Ford of property. He made a lot of money by basically building tenement blocks for people who, didn't have a huge amount of cash in places like Brooklyn and Queens. Fred Trump was tough. And he always said to his children, you've got to be a killer and you've got to be a king. There is no failure here.
Henry and Donald had one challenge in common that few rulers have had to face. Both took power in the middle of a communications revolution, and both used it to their advantage. In Tudor England, the printing press was still a relatively new invention, and Henry, at war again, found himself under attack from a barrage of pamphlets.
Henry was getting a really bad press for the war with Scotland, thanks to really the beginning of newspapers. These news sheets were being printed, which conveyed news about the killing of women and children in Scotland, about the razing of Edinburgh to the ground. Henry was now at an all-time low in terms of his popularity. He had to do something to win back public opinion.
Henry VIII was someone who was very vulnerable to criticism. He reacted very fiercely to criticism. And so as his critics blast him in pamphlets, Henry reacts in kind by using the exact same means against them.
The pamphlets branded Henry a horrible monster, but the king developed an ingenious method of dealing with such attacks.
Henry had pinned up around London that these were false fables and tales, essentially that they were fake news.
Because they so poison the minds of people by writing false stories. Because you have a very dishonest newspaper up here. So here, you can have it, darling. That's all it's worth. Piece of garbage.
This is a strategy. This is a strategy used by people in power who want to show that criticism is untrue, that only they have the truth.
Fake news. Fake.
Centuries later, Donald Trump has tackled our own communications revolution and famously exploited it to the full.
It's a rather ironic moment in the Obama presidency when President Barack Obama sends out his first tweet. And it's like, look, guys, I can tweet from the Oval Office. Isn't that marvelous?
All right, I think I have done this properly, but here's the test.
Little did he know that 5 years later, his successor would build his entire candidacy, his presidency, on his ability to tweet. Why? Because in Trump's hands, Twitter becomes the most powerful tool of communications because it's direct to the electorate.
I call him Twitler. He's changed the game because he's made politics now an expression of personal will and a personality.
Twitter is an insight into his mind. He's incontinent with opinion. He's incontinent with Trumpness. It just comes out all the time. And increasingly, almost monarchical moments of magnanimity.
Donald Trump's personal helicopter descended onto the small airfield, greeted by a one-man Trump for president bandwagon.
Trump spent over a quarter of a century flirting with the idea of the presidency. As his power and profile increased, he attracted international attention. And one British journalist unearthed a rather bizarre connection between Trump and Henry.
I read somewhere that you don't like shaking people's hands because you're afraid of germs.
Well, not afraid of germs, Matt. I don't think it's a great custom. It's been proven, as you know, a person has a cold, a horrible cold, and they shake your hand. All of a sudden, 2 days later, you have a cold. You say, I wonder how that happened.
So if I shook your hand again, no fear?
No fear. No, it's not a fear.
You withdrew that very quickly, though. That was a quick withdrawal.
It's not a fear thing.
Well, I mean, it was a bit of a gimmick, the hand thing, because I didn't think it was actually true, but it turns out it was true. He is a germaphobe, and he didn't want to be, at the same time, seen as someone who's afraid of germs. Donald doesn't do fear, even with bacteria, even with viruses, which is good because if you want to run for president, as you might well do, then shaking hands is kind of part of the job, isn't it? His eyes almost sort of swiveled at the thought of these millions of hands he would have to shake in order to get into the White House.
Henry is the greatest hypochondriac ever to sit on the throne of England. He submits himself to a detailed examination by a whole team of physicians every single morning before he does anything else.
There was a real fascination for him with sickness and with avoiding it.
He won't come within a 5-mile radius of anyone who so much as sneezes.
You seem to have quite a thin skin. You get that? When I ended that interview, I said, if you do actually run for president, what would your campaign slogan be? He leant back and said, simple. Make America great again. And I chortled with laughter. I said, that is so simplistic. No one's going to take that seriously. I was so wrong.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
To cement their power and make their mark in history, Henry and Trump each had to sideline an old establishment.
What's really fascinating about comparing Henry and Donald is that they have both defined power on their own terms. You know, Henry takes on the most powerful institution in Europe. He takes on the papacy because he's fallen out of love with a woman. Donald Trump takes on the Republican Party because he wants to get into the Oval Office. He starts off with his candidacy being ridiculed, and he launches a hostile corporate takeover of this rather snooty club. And the minute you're unafraid to be outside the club, it gives you an enormous amount of power to tear the club down and make it your own. That is the secret of his power, ultimately. As his father said, be a killer, be a king.
Congratulations, Mr. President.